Hi, everyone. Today is December 29th, 2024, and we have a special guest on the show today, Yolian Ogbu. Yolian is the coordinator of the U.S. Out of Africa Network and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Africa team based in New York. Her academic research examines inter-imperialist rivalry and the conditions for internationalist working class struggle amidst the green transition from Eastern to Central Africa. As the daughter of Eritrean freedom fighters, she's committed to publicizing the history of worker fightback and connecting the struggle for liberation across the African continent. So, Yolian, thank you for coming back on the show and welcome back to the Activist News Network.
Hi, Tunde. Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're happy you're here. So I just want to dive right in. So my first question is, in your view, how does the concept of green imperialism, as seen with green hydrogen projects in Tunisia or cobalt mining in the Congo, mirror historical colonial practices? What are the implications for countries like the DRC or Tunisia, where local needs seem secondary to foreign demands?
Yes, so thank you so much. That was a really great question. How I'm understanding green imperialism is just kind of an updated way of understanding traditional imperialism, right? It's in the context of the green transition. I talk about how green imperialism is a way to kind of make specific the ways in which neocolonialism and imperialism, either through Bretton Woods institutions or through states themselves in the Western Hemisphere, use this global demand for clean energy that's happening right now and kind of working towards this low carbon capitalist future. How they use African countries as kind of the mecca for exporting these very low cost, low carbon metals, minerals, and as you mentioned, in the case of Tunisia, but also this is happening across North Africa, green hydrogen projects, as well as like solar power plants. It's gotten to the point where now even energy in the form of sunlight or water is part of this kind of imperialist bubble that's used to extract, and states are having to be party to exporting sunlight, exporting water for Western industrialization, or at least to sustain the Western industrial project. So that's kind of how I see green imperialism and why it's, I think, important to be specific in the type of imperialism that's happening here. Dominic Boyer also talks about this in the case of land grabbing instead of just traditional land grabbing. In the case of solar power plants in Morocco, where we see communal lands literally being taken for the purposes of creating huge solar power plants for the purposes of, say, Germany or a lot of other countries in Western Europe that are investing in these projects. He calls this, he says, land grabbing isn't enough. We need to call this green grabbing. Like there are like attitudes and perceptions around climate change that haven't been fully realized in the context of imperialism.
Wow. Yeah, no, thank you for that. I appreciate you bringing in that example in Morocco and Dominic Boyer's work, which is really helpful and useful in this context. So my next question is, the DRC, their reliance on foreign-owned mining industries hasn't translated into significant economic benefits for most Congolese people. Do you believe there are sustainable, independent development paths available to the DRC that avoid the pitfalls of resource extraction economies?
That is a tough question. There's no doubt historically that Congo is, as well as all the African states, have historically been underdeveloped due to colonial extractivism. But even in the modern day, we see Congo being a victim to what I'm talking about, inter-imperialist rivalry. This happened in Latin America back in the early 1900s, and it's still happening in Congo. When I talk about inter-imperialist rivalry, it's these dynamics of these larger states such as US, China, or even just I guess, wealthier states like UAE, even though maybe they're not large, but they do have that impact as like I would call sub-imperialist. These dynamics of this rivalry that's kind of happening in these other parts of the world are all clashing and intensifying their clashes in their spheres of influence in the Congo specifically, or at least that's what I talk about, but also across the African continent, which resembles a lot of the dynamics that Lenin talked about in Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. And he talks about, in his case, at least in the early 1900s, he talked about this competition between Germans and the British, and their banks that are lending to Latin American countries in order to build infrastructure like railroads. And these railroads were built in order for extraction to take place, in order for these imperialists to take their resources out and be able to, export them to their home countries, and ensure that those projects would rely on either German or British supplies. And I kind of liken this to the competition that we're seeing today. The problem on the African continent right now, and particularly in the case of Congo, is there's no sovereignty is one way to describe it, but there really just is no control. There's no domestic control over the resources, the plentiful resources that are in the Congo. And I think, a lot of people know the general story, but there was a deliberate process to liberalize the mining industry during the wars that happened, the two Congo wars. Other folks call it kind of the two African World Wars that happened in the mid to late 1990s. At the same time, this is when the height or kind of launch of neoliberal globalization happened. So when Congo and when other African states are in distress, are kind of fighting in this larger geopolitical battle that they may not know about, but they are fighting it. The multinational corporations are coming to be a part of, kind of take a piece of that pie, just as the colonial states have before. But now it's multinational corporations, and now it's seen instead of being seen as colonial extraction or resource extraction, it's seen as foreign direct investment. It's seen as like, we are bettering your we're trying to take away from this like corrupt government. So Ben Radley, actually, who works a lot on this, who's a political economist, and he does a lot of this work in the Congo, kind of talked about how there's like this 3-stage process of, in the Congolese context at least, of how the mining industry was completely liberalized and turned into this area where it's just a frenzy between all of these different multinational corporations. And actually, in I think the early 2000s, and I think it was around 2002, there were 22 multinational companies that were headquartered somewhere either in Europe or in the United States or in Canada. 22 of them were charged. Well, they couldn't have actually been charged, but the UN did an investigation and found that at least 22 of them were involved in supplying weapons and financing the rebel groups that sought to destabilize the Congo at the time, or be a part of kind of an attempt at balkanizing the Congo, because that is what the imperialists wanted when Mobutu had fled. So I'm just kind of providing this historical context because I think it's important to understand why, sustainable development in the Congo hasn't been yet realized. It's obviously because they don't have sovereignty over their own resources or even themselves, but also I do think that there are sustainable, like independent paths to development, but it won't happen off of the backs of just the Congolese. And I think this is a larger question of realizing a kind of Pan-African vision for development, because we need all of the states to be involved, just as much as European imperialists need multiple states to take part in this plunder. That's why Rwanda, Ugandan forces are involved in this plunder and extraction through these mini proxy wars. So Europeans needed other folks, and I would say the same would be needed for Africans. Africans need each other, and they're, I think with the way in which the economy have become so hyper globalized and interdependent upon one another, there isn't kind of one tried and true national development path that will work, outside of not participating or cooperating or working with other states with that kind of same revolutionary vision, which is why projects like the AES, for example, are really important in understanding dismantling kind of borders and thinking about this larger identity that we have as like African workers.
Yeah, I really appreciate that response. I like that idea of, cooperation, unity of African states is the path forward, to address a lot of these issues. The next piece was really talking about how large scale green projects like hydrogen production in Tunisia, how they often have severe local impacts, such as land and water scarcity. And in the Congo, as you were speaking about, that cobalt mining can have similar effects. So, how do you see the relationship between projects like that and the displacement and disenfranchisement of local communities in these countries? And what do you think can be done to mitigate these harms?
Yeah, absolutely. The green hydrogen project that a lot of folks are talking about in Tunisia is part of this larger wave trend, I would say, of private finance and state capitalists playing a very large role in trying to monopolize on the demands for a clean energy transition. The fact of the matter is, fossil fuels are going to run out in the next 30 years. Fossil fuel companies themselves know this. That's why Shell, BP, Exxon, so many of these other major corporations, even OPEC, just largely as like a bloc, know this. And this is why we have countries like the UAE, Saudi, and these multinational firms investing heavily in renewable energy projects. You see them going to place in the same places that they are drilling oil from. They're also investing in wind turbines, in green hydrogen projects, vis-a-vis development banks. And I think this is kind of there's this new resurgence of a state capitalism that isn't really being talked about, that there is an expansion of these states' roles as promoters of capital accumulation under the guise of, well, we need to make sure that we meet the carbon emission trends and demands, and being able to lower our carbon emissions. Under that guise, they are literally multiplying their role as states, their hegemony as states, through these corporate entities, whether that's sovereign wealth funds like those in the UAE and Saudi. Particularly the Gulf states are known for having these sovereign wealth funds that are literally taking part in investing in critical mining projects, investing in these green hydrogen projects. And then also in the case of just state-owned corporations, and in the case of like national development strategies, climate is such a big part of those conversations. And I don't think we can talk about large scale renewable energy projects until we talk about like who kind of holds where is renewable energy the most plentiful and where is the production of that the most plentiful. So outside of the kind of historic understanding of the industrial project of the Western Hemisphere, we saw that everyone has been talking about kind of who is to blame for climate change. And it is, obvious that the global north, takes a lot of that responsibility for the emissions, considering how industrialized the global north is at the expense of the global south. So then you'd have one camp say that we need to focus on industrializing the global south. Then we need to be able to meet the needs of people through kind of mimicking the same developmental approaches that the US had. Although that's fairly impossible at this point, given the time that we have, but also the lack of capital and technological resources and things like that. The other part too is that the African continent just cumulatively only is responsible for about 4% of global emissions. Part of that is because over half of the continent does not have access to electricity, right? About like 650 million, I think, if not more, do not have access to electricity. So they can't possibly kind of contribute to global emissions. But the other part of it is that the African continent, as many scientists have looked into this, as even, folks that have been researching renewable energy production have looked into this, have seen that the African continent actually holds the most potential for renewable energy. And we not only have the most potential, but we actually have the capacity to completely phase out any sort of dependence on fossil fuels. Because at this moment, most African countries, outside of, say, like the largest country, say, is like Nigeria, have to import import oil in order to, create what little electricity they do have for the class citizens. So I think what's interesting is we have the capacity where we're at right now. It's like we don't even need to drill anymore. We don't even need to like do anything else outside of creating the processes for renewable energy to be manufactured, to be disseminated across this wide spectrum of people. And the other issue is that because we lack the technical process of it, and all of that is owned and controlled by, which is by no, it's not a mistake, and this wasn't coincidence. It's all controlled by major superpowers, particularly, and for a long time it's been the United States, but as of recently, China, for example, controls about 80% of refining processes in the critical minerals industry. That's not a mistake. They have spent the past couple of decades building up their infrastructure and supplies because they understood the need for critical minerals in the long run. So we have all of what we need. We've got the minerals, we've got the sunlight. That's the other thing. When we think about solar panels and the need for that, we just actually can't produce the technology. We don't have the means to manufacture and deploy said solar panels or wind turbines on our own. We need other folks involved, other parties. And because of the political position of a lot of these African states, we are still subordinate to the terms and conditions that countries in Europe, the United States, and even China say that, we have to do. Although, China, I will say, has more considerable or understandable terms and conditions for loans and things like that. But just regardless, there is no kind of political power that African states hold on the global stage, yet they hold all of the actual resources and all of the literal power and energy needed to not only light up the entire continent, but really the world as well. So this is the issue, and it has been intentional that we lack the manufacturing processes, the technology, and the capital, or even just the finance in general, financing, unless it comes with strings. So just real quickly, there is an example of this in in the case of what they called, I looked into, called stabilization clauses. Not too familiar with it, but stabilization clauses were these specific clauses. They're also called economic equilibrium clauses. There are clauses in these contracts, particularly in mining contracts on the African continent or in Latin America, but definitely in the global south. You don't see these clauses in the global north. And they have this colonial past, of course, where they basically said multinational firms, largely coming from Europe, would come into these African countries and negotiate with the African states and offer them the resources in order to build out the technology or mine or do anything that they need to do in order to be able to create refine minerals or take copper out of the ground or be able to build the infrastructure they need for factories and things like that. So they said, we're going to come in and give you the things that you need, but we want to make sure, we get a cut of it, which, sure, that makes sense, I guess, on the basis of like things being loans. But the clause was this stipulation that said, so we are willing to continue this contract, say Exxon, and this was mostly common in oil contracts. So Exxon, say, for example, will go into Nigeria and give them this contract and say, we're willing to draw all this oil for you and you can get a cut of it, on the basis that so long, does not matter what the politics of the country is, even if you guys change your constitution, if you guys change the government, we will only operate on the conditions in which the rules of this government have. Even if they change it, the Nigerian government, even if, say, tomorrow there is like a socialist uprising and they take, workers take state power, legally they are unable to make any changes to that contract. So this is just an example of how international law has just been used as a tool for capital accumulation at the expense of those on the other side, those that actually have the resources, namely African states. So basically they're able to say, we're going to quite literally freeze the laws in which, and the time in which we are able to take all of this out and even maybe even explore your minerals. It does not matter if you one day decide to change the rules in which you want to govern, or the type of relationship you want to have with said multinational firm. And so a lot of these contracts have existed for over 90 years that have gone unchanged despite, despite anti-colonial struggle, despite revolution. And this is the type of hold that a lot of these external actors, obviously the imperialists, take part in. So this is kind of related to renewable energy projects, and I'm so sorry for the kind of long-winded response, but it's related to renewable energy projects because the same thing is happening there. With these projects, they're having to rely on European banks. They're having to rely on other multinational firms that have no, good intention of working with African states as partners, but looking at them as subordinates, and essentially making these states liable to any of the extra costs, to any of the potential issues that come as part of the project. They have no protections. So this is the same issue, but just being replicated in the case of renewable energy.
Thank you for that very rich answer, very informative. Um, and across the continent, across Africa, there's been increased, I think, resistance to foreign-led projects that are perceived as exploitative. And so, given that you spoke about like the lack of power or control, um, uh, in your research, have you come across any grassroots movements that are pushing back against these practices? Um, yeah, what have you seen, and has any of it been effective?
Yeah, so I think there's always actually a lot of local groups that are involved in, fighting against neocolonial extraction and this kind of these green imperialist projects. In Morocco, for example, at the Ouarzazate solar power plant that is has been worked on in over, I think, the past year, there were groups in I think the Zat commune that were involved because they were literally being pushed out and displaced. They were fighting back against these projects. But, a lot of it is kind of these siloed smaller groups that are, attempting to fight back against, and of course it's grassroots level, attempting to fight back against state officials for really allowing multinational corporations to go in there and take their land and run their land dry, and causing many issues in terms of their agricultural lifestyle and things like that. So there are people resisting. There's always people resisting. And I think in the case of the AES, there are, many folks, many reports coming out talking about the move that these states have made, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, in terms of outside of just kind of kicking the French out, but thinking about renegotiating, but also just flat out tearing up these contracts that they've had that have been colonial in nature with these French companies. So there are progressive movements. The problem is they're not totally coordinated, which is why something like the AES is important to put in the kind of foundation for people to resist. When you aren't in a place and when the state is itself complicit in and pushing for these neocolonial projects to be built at the expense of their own citizens, there's very little room and space to be able to resist, albeit people still resist. But again, it's just not coordinated, in which I think even in the case of the AES, there needs to be more. We don't have time for multiple groups to have these siloed movements, which is why kind of understanding climate change and the climate crisis as this new terrain through which we are challenging and resisting neocolonialism, capitalism, and imperialism is really important, and not just kind of an added factor. Oh, yes, by the way, they're taking our resources again. It's like they are, but they're also stockpiling it. And in the case that we don't have the infrastructure for being able to meet our own energy needs, when will that happen? When the earth is literally on fire and fossil fuels are running out in the next couple of decades. So I will say that there are people resisting, and they're always resisting, and that's what I find so incredible about the resilience of African workers. But in the case that African workers don't collectively take state power and have this kind of Pan-African coordination of resource extraction, because extractivism itself is not the issue. Extractivism has been around for centuries. That's how we have survived. It's just in the ways in which it operates and how it happens, and at what length and how much is the question, and none of that is in the Africans' control, which is the primary issue here. Another kind of example that I found really interesting in research, especially on Eritrea is really not thought about when we talk about climate change, although Eritrea is also technically a part of the Sahel when we think about kind of the arid conditions and the desertification of a lot of the land. Eritrea is interesting because in the 30 or so years that we have been independent, there have been moves towards trying to build and aspire to energy sovereignty. The problem is, even in the case of Eritrea, it is very hard to develop energy sovereignty because of the lack of political kind of power that you can only get as a result of working and cooperating with others and working with partners who have the same aspirations, which is very difficult in our region, but also on the continent. So in the case of Eritrea, there's actually been a large focus due to the constraints of resources, partly because of sanctions, to develop renewable energy and produce renewable energy, particularly in rural areas. And now our capital city, Asmara, Eritrea, has announced that they have 24/7 access to electricity, which is unheard of in the Horn of Africa, let alone on the African continent. And this is happening due to the sheer kind of motivation, innovation, and resilience of African workers. So this says a lot about kind of what I was trying to get to earlier, that we have the capacity and we have the means to actually meet our energy needs. It's just folks, the neo-colonial compradors, as well as these multinational firms, have continued to collude with each other in order to stamp out and stop grassroots movements. And I also want to shout out, don't talk about this enough, I think, the movement of the Ogoni in Ogoni land, and what they have managed to do despite what they have faced. Several environmental activists have been assassinated, murdered, killed, and tortured just because they fought back against the oil spills that kept happening and the environmental devastation that kept happening. Thanks to these large oil companies and the Nigerian state. That's one example, but that's going to be a trend, and it's already happening across the continent today.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. I think pointing to those examples, the movement of the Agoni people, Eritrea and like 24/7 electricity, that's amazing. And, you mentioned the AES and folks in Morocco. I think looking at those examples of resistance and, thinking about what the possibilities are for, the coordination that you spoke about is important. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask about, how the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, have historically played roles in shaping the economies of African countries in ways that really benefit foreign interests. And I was wondering, what role do you think these institutions are playing today in perpetuating these neocolonial structures of domination on the continent?
Yeah, absolutely. So these institutions that you've mentioned, World Bank, IMF, and just the Bretton Woods institutions in general, were instrumental in kind of pushing for what I was talking about earlier, neoliberal globalization that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, and kind of ushered us into this new age in the 90s and up until today. These institutions are actually the main reason why, say, in the case of Congo, that mining laws, that their ability to industrialize and build infrastructure and actually change the lives of their own people have been very difficult to meet. In the case of Congo, for example, and across the African continent in general, the World Bank and IMF were known due to kind of after the 1970s with these structural adjustment programs that kept popping up and still are instrumental in underdeveloping these states. Their primary goal was to ensure that African economies remain export oriented. As we see, because I mentioned we have all of these resources, and I think anyone kind of like new to this idea that we have all of these resources, yet barely any of the continental Africans have access to these resources, is primarily because of the export-oriented aspect of the economy, that there is no way for African states to domestically manufacture and produce their own goods. Why you have states that have to import tomatoes and coffee beans and like literal just food things from other countries from across the world when they have it right in their backyard. And due to GMO practices, due to like big tech and agro industries, have been unable to have access to that land and to those opportunities. This makes the continent kind of this breeding ground for building all types of ridiculous technologies that are what's poisoning our foods, what's poisoning our water, what's making a lot of life inhabitable in certain parts, and why there's an increasing number of climate migrants. Certain parts in certain areas of the continent, particularly in the North African region, as well as, like I said, across the Sahel, due to like desertification. This desertification didn't happen just out of nowhere. It happened because of the practices of extraction that were unsustainable for those particular areas, and because these companies don't care enough to do anything about it. Now, the UN has literally been a part of conducting all of these investigations of illegal mining, of predatory loan practices that the World Bank and the IMF have been a part of. But all they get is a slap on the wrist. If that, there's no consequence for the decades of plunder that the World Bank and the IMF have been a part of. This is particularly why a lot of the mining industries, as you'll see across the continent, in Zambia, in Congo, even in Angola, they're not domestically controlled. A lot of it has to do with the multinational corporations, these firms working with the state to ensure that certain needs are met, certain quotas are met, or else they won't have access to capital. They will literally withhold the capital unless they retrieve certain amounts. Even in the case of Sudan, which is very interesting, it's devastating what's going on right now. But Sudan at one point was called the breadbasket of the continent, and that's not because it's that's not for no reason. It's beautiful and has incredible land and resources, even apart from the gold that has been looted and out of the country by the UAE. But Sudan was actually the Sudanese state, because of a lot of the corruption at the state level due to the neo-colonial governments working with either UAE or the US, and in some cases Russia at some point. They were, thanks to kind of the backing of the World Bank and IMF, were able to kind of figure out programs that will essentially take out all of these resources, lease out land to the Arab capitalists, to the smaller kind of sub-imperialists that are controlling majority of the land in these countries. The same could be said in Tanzania. I think there's just countless examples of how kind of the World Bank was always involved in maintaining this kind of capitalist hegemony from Western imperialists.
I appreciate that response a lot. And you already kind of spoke to this, but with the growing interest in Africa's mineral and renewable energy resources for green energy transitions, um, what steps do you think African countries can take to retain more control over their resources and ensure that their own populations benefit instead of, primarily serving foreign interests?
That is a very big question. Yes. This is tough because it'll, like I said, kind of will require more than one nation. And I think that is why it's been such a hurdle for African countries at this point to develop at the level that they aspire to. Obviously, because of the collusion from each of the states and the stakeholders like involved. But I think the main couple of steps is, I think we need to kind of change the way that folks are thinking about development. A lot of people are talking about development in the context of kind of mimicking and saying that we need to have like the same infrastructure as the West, as the United States. And by whatever means, we'll have to get there. I think there was a kind of not famous, but pretty popular interview that had come out with the Guyanese president, and I believe one of the mainstream media outlets, I think it was like CNN or something, but basically in that interview, which they took a clip of and posted it, the Guyanese president was totally upset at the journalist for for questioning the practices of the government and how they plan on lowering carbon emissions and protecting, wildlife and conservation and things like that. And his response was that, there's this Western chauvinism that kind of comes from these same people that are involved and historically responsible for totally decimating many areas of our wildlife and nature, and for putting us in this mess in the first place. I don't think that necessarily translates to, well, now we just need to develop on the basis of our own interests. Like, yes, but also not at the expense of our environment as well. And that's what puts the African continent at such a unique position. As I mentioned earlier, there's no need to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure on the African continent anymore. Actually, if we did, we'd be going backwards. There's no business case for this type of, for looking towards this type of development. And if any country, and if any multinational firm like, Exxon, and all of these other corporations that are attempting to extract and, wanting to work with these states on the basis of extracting oil, that is a red flag, obviously, but also they're lying to you, basically, because it's not a matter of, if it goes out of business, the entire industry. It's just when. And as I mentioned, we have about 30 years. And then I think the 40 or so years for our coal to be completely depleted as well. So I think the focus should be on developing sustainable ways in which we can be able to build infrastructure to support renewable energy, which will have to come from a couple of ways. There's localized strategies for this. There are strategies that people have employed to put in rural areas to support building infrastructure, as like build literal buildings that rely on passive solar in order to heat themselves up. This actually happened in Burkina Faso, but also across the continent, where there's a famous article that talked about saying that, we don't need aircon, as in like the actual AC anymore. We can just build our buildings with passive solar design using local resources, like local instead of like getting concrete, like literally importing concrete, using what is the alternative of that is kind of meets the same effect, but is local to the region or even just the respective town or in province. And they were able to build schools off of that don't need electricity in the case of like AC. And this is due to the ingenuity and innovation of folks in the country that know what they have and what they can be able to use in order to stop relying on these on LNGs and any form of like natural gas or petroleum. So I think, there's already a trend of local groups attempting to find ways to phase out of fossil fuels, even without the state in mind. But if states can take this on, instead of thinking about working towards, mimicking the development route of the United States and Europe, which is, again, impossible due to the fact that they were only able to develop and industrialize thanks to off of the backs of an exploitation of the resources and people on the African continent. But the other part of it is that we can't be able to develop sustainably without each other. So as much as the economy is hyper-globalized and interdependent, I'm not suggesting that we kind of retreat and take part in kind of trade restrictions or attempt to kind of put protectionist policies in place where each state kind of develops on their own terms. In fact, in the case of Eritrea, if other states were kind of had the same vision and the same politic and the same strategy in terms of development and thinking about what it means to kind of build, aspire to a sovereign region, country, continent, we would be a lot more ahead because we could rely on each other for certain resources. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah talks about this, and several others talked about this, and this is why they were eventually ousted or assassinated, of course. So there's reason for this, but I think there's a resurgence, and it's necessary in the case of the context of the climate crisis that we think about working, cooperating with states, and not just states, but between African workers to kind of develop alternative ways of building infrastructure that actually kind of works with the environment and not against it.
Absolutely. Really appreciate that vision. And just lastly, what inspired you to focus on these topics of, the green transition, as it relates to the African continent, and specifically on the regions of Central and East Africa? Yeah, what got you to focus on that in particular?
Well, so thank you for this question, because it's not often that I get to talk about like this connection. So obviously I'm Eritrean and my family was involved in the Eritrean Revolution, but something that I thought about constantly growing up was how did they do it? How did they actually successfully win? And for context, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front was completely isolated, had no external support. The Derg regime at the time, which was the Ethiopian state government, which was a faux communist government, used the financial backing and arms support or weapons from not only the United States but also from the Soviet Union. And that's a touchy subject for a lot of people, but that is the truth. And so Eritrea was completely isolated. It was seen as this kind of secessionist movement. But for 30 years, they had fought and won due to kind of just the political will and sheer discipline of the fighters, and not just those that were fighting on the front lines, but those that were involved in the everyday kind of mechanics of the revolution, which I think is very interesting and something that we need to think about. In the case of, and why I'm talking about kind of the climate, Eritrea is actually very interesting because in the 30 years that they were fighting, because they did not have access to, say, like other ways to build communication networks, they didn't have many resources. A lot of what they had was just stolen from the enemy. They stole arms, they stole gasoline, they stole all of these things. And what was interesting that I found was that they actually harvest and harness solar energy to build water filtration devices, to build communication networks, radio devices all across the country. And they used solar, they used the sun, and there had to have been a way that they did that under duress and specifically under war. So I am fairly interested in looking at Eritrea, not just because of my personal background, but because of how they were able to use renewable energy in the 1900s in order to fight back and kind of being seen as this technology of resistance. And on the other side, Congo, on the other spectrum, has never been able to see a complete revolution, has attempted and have constantly been squandered and constantly been beat back down from kind of whichever angle, whether that's through the assassination of Lumumba, but even in the Malala rebellions and all the rebellions that happened after his assassination were completely squandered. And so I always kind of thought about what that would look like to realize the revolution of the Congolese in the context of the climate crisis as well, is because the Congolese also have access to all of these resources, what would it be like to repurpose? And I take from Walter Rodney in Decolonial Marxism when he talks about repurposing technology, repurposing the capitalists' tools for exploitation. How do we repurpose those things for revolution and resistance? Eritrea did it in one case, and although it was fairly isolated, how do we kind of build that and expand upon that idea and that vision? And Congo, I think, has a lot of those answers. So that's why I'm interested in looking at those.
Oh, I really appreciate hearing, what brought you to focus on these topics, these regions. And yeah, I think those are the things we need to be studying. How do we, um, learn from these examples of, revolution, and how do we build towards revolution so that, the people can, benefit from and be in control of their resources, their societies. So really, those are all the questions I have for you today. Was there anything else you wanted to discuss before we close?
No, I think that's it. I mean, these were wonderful questions, and thank you so much for having me today. Great conversation.
Of course, Yolian, thank you so much for coming on the show again, and we look forward to having you back.
Absolutely. Thank you.